Okay, welcome back everyone. Our third presenter is Sally Haynes from Agasson's. A bit of background about Sally. She's had quite a number of careers, from owning her own business to being a musician in the Australian Regular Army. She's very much interested in animal behaviour and welfare of both livestock and companion animals. And this has led to her doing a PhD at the Animal Welfare Science Centre at the University of Melbourne. Sally's recently been engaged by the startup company Agasson's, who are commercialising a fenceless farming or a virtual fence for cattle, which Sally's going to present to you today. And her role with Agasson's is to work with research organisations like CSIRO to ensure the highest animal health and welfare standards are met. So please welcome Sally. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Yasmin, and thanks for the opportunity today. Oh, it's gone up there. Brilliant. Do we have a? All right, we're going to do photos first. Great, fantastic. I'm just waiting for my slides to go up. If I click that, it'll work? Super. Love a bit of technology. So I'm not the technology person, can you tell? I'm the animal person. So I am going to talk to you today about virtual fencing and where we're at in the research, what we understand about animal behaviour. But I am also going to talk about animal welfare, because that's the perspective that I come from, and talk about a little bit at the beginning about why it's important, and how we study it and how we measure it. So then we do put these technologies on our animals, that we make sure that the animals are coping particularly well with it. So just a little bit about livestock welfare. There is a sense that if we're talking about welfare, there is a crossover between ethics and welfare, because ethics is about how we make decisions about how we use animals, okay? So there is a thought that we have domesticated animals, therefore we have a moral obligation to look after their welfare, all right? So that's one perspective. I'm sure everyone's aware of what's happening in New South Wales with the greyhound industry at the moment. If you're not, and you just you live under a rock, the greyhound industry is, legislation's being passed for it to be shut down. And the one thing that's kept coming up in that discussion, and the Premier of New South Wales mentioned it, is that the industry had lost its social licence. And I know that's sort of been taken to task a bit by the greyhound industry using that term, but I am actually seeing it a lot. Right? And it's not just in relation to industry, it's in relation to farming in terms of livestock management. Where I'm talking to someone in government about changing regulations around virtual fencing, and they're involved in livestock management, beef production, they start immediately talking about social licence. We have to make sure that the community approves of what we're doing with animals. Okay, so we've decided we can farm them, but we have to make sure that we get them from paddock to plate ethically, and that the community accepts how we do that. So in terms of looking after welfare, we need to safeguard public confidence. Okay, so there has to be not only that we are looking after animal welfare, but there's a perception that we're doing so. Okay, so they can be two different things. And we need to safeguard market confidence. We need to ensure that our producers can get their animals to market and get them to the public and get them through the food chain. So just some examples of some current livestock issues. Confinement, obviously that's a big issue with a number of species, certainly poultry, pigs, and even feedlot cattle. Routine husbandry procedures, so dehorning, docking, mulesing, there's a nice big one for you, debeaking with poultry. So there's a lot of things that are constantly in the public eye, and not only the public eye, but they're going to be animal welfare organisations. And slaughter methods, right? So that's another one. I guess it's important to realise how animal welfare is affecting a lot of decisions that are being made at the moment. So some principles of good animal welfare. We want to maximise positive emotions. Minimise stress. We want to minimise negative emotions, fear and pain. And another one I could mention there is also anxiety. So if you're not sure what's going to happen to you from minute to minute, that can result in some anxiety. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later in terms of virtual fencing, because that's probably one of the biggest concerns that some of the welfare organisations have. And we want to ensure adaptation. Does everyone understand about homeostasis? Right? So if we've got an animal or a human being and your body is always trying to be in balance, right? So it's going to increase blood pressure or decrease blood pressure, or if you're hungry, you need more sugar, it's going to motivate you to go and find something to eat, all those sorts of things. So that's what homeostasis is, trying to keep your body in balance all the time. And we can relate these things to stress behaviours as well, not just sort of those internal micro changes that happen. And that helps the animal adapt. And if they can't maintain homeostasis, so if they're constantly under some sort of stress or pain, then they're out of balance and they're not adapting, and then we have a welfare problem. And we need to provide opportunities for normal behaviours. And normal is inverted commas, because not all normal behaviours amongst animals are things that we'd see desirable in our livestock. So animal welfare science is basically we study the animal's biology in response to how it's treated. Okay, so we can look at their physiological health, so how their body functions, their physical health, and it might be outcomes like reproduction rates and all those sorts of things, and we might look at their emotional state. And how do we assess all this? Well, often the first thing that comes out of when there is a stress response from an animal's worried about something or it's in pain, is a behaviour. So the behaviour is designed to limit whatever is happening to it. So if an animal's thirsty, it's going to change its behaviour to walk towards the water trough and get a drink, right? So something really simple like that. Or if it gets a fright, it might run. So we can look at some short-term responses to actually measure animal behaviour and draw inferences about welfare. So we can look at things like startle responses, whether an animal orients towards something that it's frightened of, how long it takes to return to doing what it was doing. So say in a virtual fence situation, we might see how long it takes for an animal to start feeding again. And that might give us an indication of whether the animal was stressed by the experience it had with the virtual fence. Does that make sense to everybody? We might see a defensive or a flight reaction. That might also give us some information. We might look in changes in body position, so changes in activity. So is the animal less active or more active as a result of our intervention, our environmental change in the environment? Are they feeding like they normally feed? Are they ruminating like they normally ruminate? Are they interacting with other animals like they normally do? So we've still got some questions to answer about how this changes herd behaviour, right? If you have a virtual fence in place. And other behaviours you can get are stereotypies and redirected behaviours, but we're not expecting to see any of those. Physiological measures that we can take, right? So we can actually measure the body's acute and chronic stress response to a stressful situation. We can use body temperature. So you can actually put a think on eye button, right? Insert it in the cow's rectum and actually look at temperature fluctuations and actually pinpoint where the stressful experience has occurred. So they've been doing that in transport of calves, which is really interesting stuff. We can obviously look at respiratory rate, but that gets a little bit hard when you've got 500 kilogram cows and you're trying to get close to check respiration. But there's all sorts of gadgets that we can use for that. And heart rate. And our other favourite one is stress hormones. So things like cortisol and endorphins. So it's kind of like when you're about to cross the road and you're looking at your phone and suddenly a truck just goes straight down the road and you either jump back and your heart races, and trust me, your cortisol just went through the roof, right? So because that's that's designed to get you out of a dangerous situation. However, if you have elevated cortisol for a long time, say, I don't know, you're studying and you're doing exams and you've got elevated cortisol, your immune response goes down, all sorts of things happen around that elevated cortisol. Health measures. So we can actually measure the physiological cost of a chronic stress response, right, of an animal. So we can look at things like food conversion, right? So if an animal's stressed, they're going to eat as much food, but they're not going to put the weight on. Pretty important in livestock. We can look at things like reduced reproductive performance, and that might be how many offspring the animal has, what the birth weight is, what the death rate is. So all these things can come from a stressed mother. It's amazing. It's quite extraordinary. And we can also have impaired immunity as well. So more, basically, increased morbidity and increased mortality when you've got stressed animals. So now I'm going to talk about the history of virtual fencing and where we've got to. So I'm going to cover a few questions that David raised earlier in his discussion about animals recognising where their virtual fence was and associating it with like a rock or something in the environment. So I will mention that. So the first thing we tend to think of with electronic collars is dogs and cats. So actually in Victoria you can legally use electronic collar on a cat. So I find it a little bit odd. But anyway, you can use them on a dog and cat. They've been around for about 50 years. In the 60s when they first started using them, they were exactly what they were shock collars. They were zap and fry. They were pretty nasty things, and I think a lot of the military and gun dog people were using them at that level. But they have changed them, and they're not as physically painful as they used to be, and they certainly don't fry a dog, as has been said, but they can still cause anxiety. Okay. And the main reason why training collars cause anxiety is because the person clicking the button, because they're human and they have really bad timing and they don't have a very good understanding of animal behaviour. The other system we know in dogs that is used is the containment systems. Now what that involves is it's a buried wire system. So basically the fence doesn't move. It never moves. It's always there. But that actually is part of the problem. One of the problems is that you get lesions forming from the contact points connecting with the skin of the dog. So there's actually a limit on how long those collars can be on the dogs. And this is where the big problems comes in, is around anxiety. It's unpredictable for the animal, right? So if you've got a buried wire, that relies on the animal's location relative to the wire. The animal can't think that there's a wire there. That just doesn't make sense to them, right? So they're responding to something that's invisible. That's why they call it a visible fence, right? So it becomes really unpredictable. So when they get shocked, they're not quite sure why they got shocked, because they could be standing still, they could be walking, right? So there's no connection for the animal to why they got shocked. Of course, there's issues with owner abuse and misuse as well. The other issue with these sorts of systems is that once an animal crosses the boundary, they can't come back in again. There's no they're not two-way. They don't allow them to come back in again. So with livestock, they took that technology and did exactly what David was talking about and did a buried wire system, right? So they actually put collars on cows and they had a buried wire system. And it's on trial in the UK, and it's actually in like a forest. Forget the name of it, but there is a video on YouTube. It's quite interesting. But they've got the same issues because, there's no studies, there's no evaluation. They know it actually works to keep the animals in an area, but there's no studies on animal welfare. There's no evaluation of it. It's very expensive. They basically dug out the ground and put the wire down, concreted everything in. It's not exactly just, for the average farmer. And it's not movable. So what they've actually done, they're trying to keep cattle in a forest, because the cattle eat some weeds that if the cattle don't eat the weeds, then the other plants don't have a chance to grow. It's kind of strange, because we're trying to do the opposite thing here, is keep them out of the forests. And again, the same problem, the animal that crosses the boundary can't return. Right, so we come to shepherding systems, and the first one I'm going to talk about is the IRO round. And this was actually patented by a very knowledgeable guy called Dean Anderson in the US. He was working with MIT, so there are lots of tech people, which is, you know, when the guys at work ask me about tech stuff, and I say it's just like an iPhone, make it work like an iPhone. So they use natural sounds and shock to guide the animals. So what they were trying to do is actually guide them left and right. So they were actually trying to use directionals, which the first time I read about it, I just thought, way too complicated, just way too complicated. And it turns out, yeah, it probably is. It actually was too complicated, and the animals had trouble understanding that. It hasn't been commercialised. What CSIRO have done is they took a different approach and said, what if we actually look at animal behaviour and shape our system around that? So when you shape a system around animal behaviour, you end up addressing animal welfare concerns as well. So what they did is they focused on learning theory, okay, learning principles and learning theory, and the collar responds to animal behaviour, not location. Okay, so our virtual fence, if you have it lying like in this GPS space, right, and the animal's standing on it, nothing happens. Right, so the animal's not getting confused. If the animal walks towards the fence, then something happens, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. So what we do is allow animals to both predict and control their environment. And being able to predict what happens in your environment and having some sense of control actually reduces anxiety. And again, that's true for humans and animals. So think about, you know, turning up to work and it's really, really stressful and you've got no control and everyone's yelling at you, telling you to do stuff. You're going to get pretty anxious after a while. If you feel like you've got autonomy and control and you can make choices about your environment, about what happens to you, anxiety reduces. And they also measured physiological and behavioural responses to the system as well. So how it works. We've got a collar here on a cow, and we've got our person over here on the sitting down, and they've got like an iPhone app or an iPad or something like that. And then there's a base station and there's GPS. So basically the idea is that you set your movable fence, right? And that information is relayed to the collar, and the collar talks back and forth to the GPS, so that basically we all know where the cow is all the time. And there's some other factors around GPS being very power hungry, and there's things you can do like shutting the GPS down when the animal's a certain distance from the fence or it's resting or things like that. So there's lots of ways to cope with that. Some of the animal welfare benefits that we envisage for the virtual fence: having real-time monitoring of your animals. So when you combine that with some of these systems that can monitor whether animals are lying down or ruminating or things like that, that we're going to have more luck detecting early calving, illness, lameness, and just giving more information back to the landholder. Certainly we get lots of comments from people that about reducing livestock injuries on barbed wire or getting tangled in an electric fence. Mustering is a really interesting one. If you could muster a group of animals slowly by gradually moving the fence and moving them slowly in the right direction, probably going to save time and save bodies, and you're also going to know where your animals are if they haven't come in. You know, if you know, you can track the animal that hasn't come in, and you can also avoid a lot of the injuries that occur with large-scale mustering. Improve fish health. I know, who thought? So the idea of the virtual fence originally came about keeping livestock out of waterways, and that's why the fish get a mention. Fish never get a mention. So the idea is those smaller those nice riparian zones where the cattle come in, do a lot of damage to the rivers, that you could set up a virtual fence along there, let the animal in to eat the grass and the weeds when you need to get the fire risk down, and then fence the animal out again. And of course wildlife friendly fencing as well, particularly birds and bats and marsupials that get tangled up in barbed wire and all sorts of things. So we need to address the risk factors. One of the biggest ones is using the electric stimulus as an aversive. And again, this is a real risk factor and a perceived risk factor as well. So CSIRO decided that the delivery of the electrical stimulus must be preceded by an audio cue, right? So it's not aversive, but we're giving the animal information and classically conditioning them that when you hear the audio cue, if you do not change your behaviour, then you'll get a stimulus. Okay, so the animal knows that. Oh, I kind of said that already. So, and that was part of their study. So it was in response to the animal's behaviour, not where they were located. So it was about stopping when you heard the audio cue and not moving forward. So here we've got our cows and we've got our virtual fence and they're wearing the collars. The animal approaches the fence and they get an audio cue, right? If the animal stops or turns away, nothing happens at all. If the animal moves forward, they get a stimulus. Okay, so it's probably about 50% of a dog collar. Like if you had an average dog collar and it was tuned to 100, it was about 50 out of 100. A lot less than electric fence. And then once that happens, so the aversive stimulus is associated with moving forward. And once all that happens, the cycle starts again. So the animal doesn't get repeatedly zapped for moving forward. It gets another audio cue, and then if it responds to that audio cue, then it all goes quiet. So what we found is that the animal was responding, when we were doing this using handheld collars and remote controls rather than the algorithm, we found they were responding within 2 to 3 tries. They were associating the audio cue and the shock together, and when they heard the audio cue, they would start responding. So it's a little video for you. I'm just going to get our awesome tech people to play it for me at the back, if you don't mind. Oops. Beautiful. So this is a little video of some of the initial trials that we did in January. There's our little cow. So here we go. So this is these cattle were basically taught to approach and eat from this feed trough. Okay, so they're really comfortable with that feed trough, and we set the virtual fence around it, and you can just see where those rocks are. That indicated to me where the fence was. That's having trouble going, isn't it? So when the audio cue is applied, the animal figures it out that it's going to get a shock if it moves in close to the food and it moves away. So it actually is supposed to run a bit smoother than that, but it's just going in frames. It's kind of weird. So you can see this one got really close and he's put a foot forward and he got an audio cue and he goes, oh, I don't think so. I'm not falling for that again, right? So you can see he's inside the virtual fence boundary, right? But because it's responding to his behaviour, he's not associating it with the rocks. It's when he stepped forward, he got an audio cue and then he pulled back, and so he didn't get a shock. Okay? So I'm sorry about that came out kind of funny going from on the computer it looks brilliant, but going from computer to screen just kind of went. Anyway, I'm sure you get the idea. The other point that the CSIRO made was that the stress response of the animal must be minimal. Okay, so they did an experiment where they actually had cattle in a crush, and they had 3 groups of 10 animals, and and each group had a different treatment. So one group of animals was just put in the crush for 3 minutes. The second group of animal had 3 shocks at 2-second intervals. So actually they're unpredictable shocks. So remembering that, whereas ours are predictable, these are actually unpredictable shocks, which leads to more anxiety. And then they had another group of animals and they were put in a head restraint for 3 minutes. Basically, the researchers took blood samples, they measured the heart rate, and they made observations of behaviour. And then they released the cattle from the crush and observed what happened then. What did they do? How long did it take them to start feeding again, and what was their behaviour as they left the crush? So some physiological responses. There was no difference between the groups for plasma cortisol, plasma endorphins, heart rate and crush. There was no difference. The heart rate leaving the crush, so it increased for those animals that had had the unpredictable shocks delivered, and it increased for those that had been restrained in a head bale. Okay, so they had the similar responses. Behavioural, there was no difference in the sorts of behaviours that we expect to see from cattle. There was slightly more head tossing in the crush when they had unpredictable shocks, when you compare that with the control and the restraint. Flight time from crush was increased for both the shock and the restraint, and time to feed, there was no difference. Okay? So basically they concluded that the response of cattle to having unpredictable shocks delivered was no different from standard husbandry procedures that occur in a crush, right? Being restrained in a head bale. A couple of other risk factors that we have to think about. Irritation or ulceration, that was one of the problems with the dog collars, they were rubbing. One of those problems is with the amount of hair on the dogs, but we've also found that with a loose fit, the work we've done up at CSIRO, we have quite a large contact point. So rather than a small one that digs into the skin, we have a large contact point that gets a lot of coverage, but the collar can move around really loosely. So it makes contact fine to deliver the shock when necessary, but doesn't actually rub. Oh, see, get ahead of myself. And also the collar design's got to be smooth. So where you have the device, it's got to have smooth surfaces, and there's quite a bit of work involved getting that moulding so that it doesn't rub or catch or cause any injury. One of the risk factors wearing collar obviously is choking, but that's all been done. So there's fail-safe buckle designs that are to release under load that are pretty standard on the market now. Equipment malfunctions, we get a lot of questions about that. So our approach to designing this software and hardware is to design it similarly that you would a human device, a human medical device, with those processes in place, so that you make sure that the software is functioning and tested as expected. We also have a big list of risks, and one of them is an animal that's not learning, for instance. And we have an automatic cutout if the animal receives a certain number of shocks in 5 minutes, right? And we've done that in consultation with CSIRO, so that you're immediately alerted, so that you go, right, okay, so this animal's either not learning, or it's lost its collar, or the connection's not there somehow, something's going wrong. Inappropriate use. So one of the most important things with this is that a human is not operating it. We certainly did in the early trials, but the system is run by an algorithm, and that's the IP that we have exclusive rights to, and that is designed to take it out of the human hands. So as I said, we don't tend to have great timing as trainers, and that's where a lot of the anxiety comes in. And also you need to train the landholder. That's really important. That's part of that as well. As David mentioned, there's been a Commonwealth grant from the Rural Research and Development for Profit program. So we are working in partnership with Dairy Australia, Meat and Livestock Australia, Australian Wool International, Australian Pork Limited, CSIRO, TIA, Sydney, Melbourne Universities and the University of New England. And we're hoping that that will really start to expand the knowledge that we have in terms of about moving animals, numbers of animals involved, numbers of animals that need collars on, all that sort of information. So I think I'm going to leave it there, and maybe that'll give us a bit of time for questions.
Thank you, Sally. That was great. Sorry, I haven't got this turned on. We've got time for a few questions, and do you need time, Mike, to set up with Will? Okay, so we've got a bit of time for questions for Sally, if anyone's got one.
Hi Sally, Peter Smith, thanks for that. But there's something I don't sort of get, and
Yep.
I think you're going to have to explain it to someone like me a bit more.
That's okay.
In the video, the cow moving towards the feed trough,
Yep.
I can't see why the audio cue and the shock going off when it takes a step towards it is, I can't see how that is actually predictable, nor do I see how it's location free, because other times when they walk in other places that doesn't happen.
Yep. So no, it's a good question, and it's always hard to know how much information to put in, because it's hard to know what to explain. If you think about it like a regular electric fence, right? So say this is an electric fence, that's a visual cue, right? So the first time I see that visual cue, it means nothing. So, and I see some really nice clover on the other side, and I'm just going to walk up here and I'm just going to touch that, and all that was a bad idea because that was a visual cue that's going to hurt, right? If I go and move that fence, animals don't tend to be good at generalising, some species. You might have to go and touch that a couple more times before you realise that. Now every time I see that fence, that white tape, that means that's going to hurt if I touch it. So it's a very similar thing with the audio cue. So they walk, they hear an audio cue, the first time it means nothing to them at all. They keep walking, right? And within probably a second or 2 seconds, they get the shock. And usually they have a reaction that they run forward or they turn around and run backwards and they go, whoa, what was that, what was that? And then the second time they walk up, and you see the audio cue, and you almost see this little twitch. They go, hang on. It's just a classical conditioning, associative learning, putting the two together, right? So they walk up and they hear the audio cue and they go, oh, hang on, I've heard that, and something bad happened when I didn't do that. And they walk forward again and they get the shock and they turn around. And the third time they go, audio cue, no, just I know that the audio cue means I have to stop and turn around, and then nothing happened. It's extraordinary how quickly. It's like Pavlov's dog, that they hear the trolley coming and they start salivating because they know the food's coming. They associate the trolley coming with the food coming and they start to salivate. So it's a really, it's the most basic thing of learning theory, but it's a little bit hard to get your head around. So that animal, so they actually did some of this work in Queensland. They haven't published, there's no papers published on it, but they had it in halters, which is why we had to do so much work around collars and getting the collars right. They put halters on these cattle, and they had 4 groups of 10, so repeatable design, and they actually kept 98% of the animals out of the riparian zone, where there was molasses put down near the river as well. They kept them out there for about 98% of the time. So they only had the odd animal that at the middle of the night would go for a bit of a gallop and go down and they just let that one run. So if an animal gallops through, they just let it run. It's like, that's fine. So obviously not designed for boundary fences, but internal fences. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. So the punishment becomes predictable.
Yes. So the audio is not predictable, but the punishment is if you don't respond to the audio. Because they get associated together, they get paired together. All right? It's like click, treat. Clicker training, anyone? Click, treat, click, treat. Click didn't mean anything, now it means treat's coming. Just the same thing.
What's the stance of the DPI, RSPCA and Department of Ag at the minute with it?
So I've been engaging with all the organisations, including RSPCA Australia, RSPCA Victoria and Animals Australia, and they've actually been really receptive to what we're doing. because they understand the science behind it. So most of these organisations have scientists who understand animal behaviour and welfare. So I've been really impressed about how open they have been. We need to change regulations in Victoria, New South Wales, WA, Northern Territory, right? That needs to be done. That is our difficult passage at the moment, and I guess it's anything where a politician has to change something around animal welfare is going to get a lot of attention. So we're in conversation with the department at the moment, it's an ongoing process, and it's quite sometimes it's quite laborious to change regulations. It's actually not the Act that we need to change, which is actually really helpful, it's the regulations. But in New South Wales, we need to have the device added to approved devices list, things like that. But then they need data and research to back that up as well.
How far off it is in Victoria from getting approved?
I honestly couldn't say at this point. I couldn't even give you a approximate because we're still in conversation. So we've been in conversation with Department of Environment are just busting for it because they really want to try it on the riparian zones to start with. And we've got a lot of support from the catchment management authorities, and they actually funded us some initial funding, and they're also coming up with some more funding as well. So, but we're still trying to work through the intricacies of getting that changed in the regulations, because they do sunset, the regulations sunset in I think 2018 maybe, but we don't want to wait that long. Yeah, so right to you. Yeah, right to you, Minister. Oh,
Sally, we saw one animal there in the video.
Yep.
How does it go change with a mob mentality?
yeah. So that's what they did in Queensland. They had 10. So we figured out that
more than 10 though.
Yeah, you get mob behaviour once you get more than about 6 animals. So you want 6. It's really surprising, but 6 plus, and you'll start getting mob behaviour. So at the moment, we're only working with those sorts of numbers because if you want to know what's happening to each individual animal, then you really can't go putting it on mobs of 40, 50 just yet. You really need to get it right on those small animals because you need to look at individual reactions because all these animals are going to be different. And we're going to have temperament differences which might make them react slightly differently.
Yeah, I'm just thinking of the spook factor that comes with a shock.
Yeah, and if they do spook, it's no big deal. If they spook and go through the fence, because they're not designed for external boundaries, although I see that as a double fence, like an extra fence on an external boundary, it's okay to let that animal move through the fence and then be shepherded back. Because what happens is if they run through the fence will reset in front of that particular animal. So the fence remains the same for all the other animals, but for the animal that's beyond in the exclusion zone, it will reset there and then gradually shepherd it back, gradually move back until it comes back to its friends.
I've got a question about animal welfare,
Yep.
maybe. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about, is there many similarities between the greyhound industry and livestock industries, like the situation, I suppose, and how do we avoid that sort of thing into the future? Obviously, it's a fair way into the future, but
Yeah.
it keeps coming up.
No, great question, and it's something that's been coming up a lot because I'm also involved in companion animals a lot, so the same questions have come up with companion animals, and I do dog sports, and same things could come up to them. So I think partly in the livestock industry you've got issues around more people. So I think in the greyhound industry you have a small industry with not a lot of people in the public really heavily involved. All right, so comparatively compared to livestock. But the other thing, the way to avoid it is for industry to lead the way, right? So to be proactive. Because what you don't want is, in my view, what you don't want is someone to have to break into your slaughterhouse or into your piggery to take videos to push change. You want industry to say, no, we see the need for change and we're going to work with research organisations to bring that change forward. I think being proactive is probably the number one thing, and be seen to communicate that to the public, because I mean, as a research scientist, I know how difficult it is for even people to understand that barn-laid eggs versus caged eggs isn't all that simple in terms of welfare problems. It's just not that simple and free range. I lost a couple of chooks to fox last week. That's not very good welfare for my free range hens, is it? Like, seriously, like, I mean, these are the arguments that you sort of have with people and bring up. It's just not clear cut. So communicating that, and also being able to track paddock to plate. I think that's really important. People are starting, not everyone, but some people do care where their produce comes from, and to be able to say this animal has had this life and has been killed humanely in this slaughterhouse to get to your plate. And I think that is where it has to go. Is that? Yeah. Any more? Great.
I think I'll just hold off on the questions now, but that's there's been some really good questions. There's time to catch up with Sally at the end, and you're sticking around.
Yeah.
Yep. So let's put our hands together and thank Sally. Thank you.